Okay, a couple of announcements. One is that I'm not going to have office hours tomorrow. I already sent out an email to that effect. But I will send you out an email. But we'll have the review session on the Thursday before the exam. The exam's on the 9th. And then I don't know exactly what the date is for that Thursday, but so you can either do it at 6 to 7 or 7 to 8. So you might want to just think about that. So we won't set up that time right away, but maybe by Friday we'll set the we'll set the exact time. So it'll be the exam is on that Monday, the 9th, I believe, is that when the exam is. Yeah, Monday the 9th. So whatever that Thursday is prior to that was when we'll have the review session. Okay. Any questions on that? No. Okay. So anyway, like I said, we'll go ahead and establish. We'll establish whether it's at 6 o'clock. It'll be 6 to 7 or 7 to 8, and you guys can maybe think about what's best for you guys. All right. Band pick of the week for this week is Sam Fender. Anybody heard of Sam Fender? A couple of guys, right? Okay, so he's a young indie rock person. He was part of BBC's Sound of 2018, so that's where he released his first EP. You might want to just listen to one of his songs. It's called The Borders. Again, he's from the UK, so again, you might want to take a listen to Sam Fender as the band pick of the week this week. All right. So last time we were talking about democracy, right? And we were talking about that Hayek has a number of reasons why democracy is the mechanism by which you'd want to when only one outcome can prevail, right? You're going to have to make a decision about when only one outcome can prevail. How might you do that? And again, democracy being one of the foundations of liberalism that Mises talked about. And then one of the things that we pointed out was this his point that making the best use of knowledge is he says the debate over issues will advance the state of knowledge. And again, we noted that even if you don't know anything about what the particular issue is, that there are people that, because of the way the legislative process works, there are people that will. Whether it's lobbyists or whether it's special interest groups or whether it's National Rifle Association or whatever, and they're going to be talking to the legislators through a democratic system. Whereas if you have an authoritarian system, whoever's in charge of Nigeria or whatever, they might be able to just say, okay, this is the way we're going to do it. Or if this were back in the 13th century, you didn't try to persuade the king that this was the best way to do it. The king had their own authoritarian ability to make things happen. So this debate over the issues is something that's important to Hayek. But then he says that democracy can only make sense if you can form an opinion independent of your government. All right? So let's think about that. He says democracy only makes sense only if you can form an opinion independent of your government. So if the government gives you all the information, then how is it that it makes sense for you to be forming your own opinion? So again, what do we have in the Constitution, right? Freedom of the press, right? We have the right to peaceable assembly, right? Freedom of speech, so that you guys can go out and form an opinion independent of what your government is telling you. Whereas if this were the Soviet Union, right, or this were China today, right, you don't have a lot of ability to form an opinion outside of what your government's telling you. So yeah, you could say, okay, we're going to let people vote on these issues. We're going to let people vote on who's going to be the legislator or whatever. But if the government is the only one giving you information, then it's impossible for you, or unlikely that you'll be able to form an opinion independent of what your government's telling you. Now, that leads us to think a little bit about what happens in that you have 90% of K-12 is all going to government schools, right? And about 80% of higher ed go to government schools. Just to give you something to think about. Is it possible that if you want your federal government to have a curriculum that everybody's got to get, right? If you have lots of different public schools, you have lots of different government schools, then it may be that one school district will be teaching one thing, and another school district will be teaching something else, etc. Or if you have one of the reasons for the charter school movement is to say that charter schools are public schools, but people can form them, right? And I can basically enter an industry, right? I can form a charter school in the city of Detroit and compete with what the Detroit public schools are doing, okay? So if there's lots of different public schools, then this is not as large a problem. But if you had something where every government school or every public school has to teach, then you might be a little concerned given what Hayek's talking about. Now, I was on the State Board of Education in Michigan for 6 years, and the State Board of Education, if you've ever looked at Michigan's Constitution, the State Board of Education is in charge with all supervision of all public education in the state of Michigan. Okay, so I used to, when I was on the board, I used to refer to the things as government schools, which was not something that they were used to hearing. But and when we had a case come up where we were supposed to, the legislature was having us make essentially what you might call a core curriculum now for the schools. I said, well, how am I supposed to know what the mother in Menominee wants her kid to know, and how much what the father in Alpena wants his kids to know? I can't possibly know that, right? We were talking about that early on when Hayek's talking about information is decentralized. But a related issue to that is how can how can we make it so that we have a broad range of opinion as you're being educated about things? Again, Hayek says one can have a profound respect for the convention of majority rule and yet little respect for the wisdom of the majority. Okay? So that you think that majority rule is the best way to majority rule is the best way to make decisions when only one outcome can prevail. However, that is, I'm going to say, you may believe, that is, he says, you have a profound respect for the convention of majority rule, yet basically you're aware that the majority may often get things wrong, right? Another way to put it. Again, he says, you might have little respect for the wisdom of the majority. So if you read the Federalist Papers, right, which you've probably all, how many have read the Federalist Papers, right? You have to read that in Politics 101 or whatever, right? So what do you know about the Fed? I mean, that's what they're talking about in the Federalist Papers, right? They want to limit what the limit the power of the temporary majority that Hayek's been talking about. And why would you want to do that? Because you have to worry about factions. You have to worry about people, making. The majority just might not get it right. So what are you supposed to do? That you're supposed to try to influence, the minority should try to influence the opinion of the majority. That's what this is what Hayek's point is, that the minority should attempt to influence the opinion of the majority. Which leads us again to this point about the battle of ideas, right? This idea that, Mises talks about it in liberalism. What's going to make it so you don't have World War II, et cetera? What's going to make that is that liberalism, you're going to convince people that it's important that they think about this thing, and convince people here's what they ought to, this liberal political philosophy. Here's what the foundations are. You should be able to explain it to people. You should be able to persuade them. And Bastiat is similarly saying here, you should be able to explain this to other people. Similarly, Hayek here saying, emphasizing in this point that the minority should try to influence the opinion of the majority, and of course, that means there's going to be a debate over the issues itself, and if there's a debate over the issues, then you'll advance the state of knowledge. Now, it might be interesting to think through today about how much actual debate is going on over issues, and how much of it is just one side just listening to, there was a special that I just saw on social media. How does it might be interesting to think through how social media works today. Can you just latch on to a social media and just listen to the same thing that you already agree with? Or people use social media to try to engage in discussion of opinion? My guess is that there's a tendency to use social media to just reinforce what you're already thinking rather than expanding the debate over the issues that Hayek would like us to do. Yeah.
Does Hayek believe in just a blanket majoritarian democracy, or in order to protect some of the human rights he deems are so necessary to protect, would he propose something closer to like a constitutional republic?
Well, again, the question is Hayek talking about a constitutional republic versus a majority. No, what he's talking about is when there's only one outcome can prevail, what's the way to do that, right? Is to have people vote on it, right? Why is that? Because of a number of things. One is it leads to social cooperation, right? I mean, you don't, just like Mises was talking about, why does he put democracy in there? But also the debate over the issues will advance the state of knowledge. He's got a reason that we're going to vote on it. Now, the mechanics of how you do that democracy, right? Should you have provinces? Should you have states? That's aside, right? But clearly, there's got to be a constitution, right? He says that the democracy has to be limited by a general principle by which we're going to govern ourselves. And where are you going to write that down? When we read chapter 12, you're going to write that down in the Constitution. One of the roles of the Constitution is to set out those general principles that Hayek was saying has to bind what the temporary majority can do. Right? He said the temporary majority's got to be bound by some general principles by which we're going to govern ourselves. Right? And the Constitution is that document. And so, however you construct it mechanically, the idea is that however you construct it mechanically, to the temporary majority, whoever's in charge, has to be bound, and how are they bound? They're bound by general principles that we've thought about how we're going to organize ourselves. All right. Then he makes a point in this chapter about, he says, majority decisions are particularly liable if not guided by an accepted common principle to produce overall results that no one actually wanted. Right? So that this is related to the unintended consequences that Mises was talking about. Remember that he said once government engages in interventionism, right, leads to unintended consequences, and then maybe further government intervention. Hayek's talking about something a little bit different here, though. He says majority decisions are liable, this is particularly liable, to produce results that no one would have intended at the beginning. Right? Unless bound by a common principle, by, again, how we're going to run things, right? Right? Unless bounded by a common principle by which we govern ourselves. And so let me, and it's going to, produce these results that we hadn't really thought at the beginning that's what we wanted. So just let me give you an example. Suppose that we have a special interest group that gets together, and they make it so that we're going to make it so that you can't import steel, right? So we have a steel tariff, or we just say, hey, which would be a tax if you buy steel. But if we just said, hey, can't import steel into the United States. So the U.S. steel manufacturers are going, wow, great idea, right? Here's the problem, though. Then somebody else says, well, I want to make it so that you can't import aluminum. Well, what are you going to say? You're going to say, oh, gee, you can't, it's okay to do it for steel, but it's not okay to do it for aluminum, right? Once you've established that principle that you can make a law that says that you can't import a particular product, then what's the unintended consequence of that, or the thing that you wouldn't have thought about? The thing that you wouldn't have thought about is that you now are going to end up with a result that we're going to do it for this, and then we're going to do it for the next product, and we're going to do it for the next product, till at the end you've inadvertently established a general principle that no one would have thought of at the beginning. And I can just give you an example. When I was on the Senate Republican policy staff, I was there for 6 years, and what I did was I advised the Michigan Republican senators, and we had a majority, so basically controlled what was going on there on economic policy. Okay, but I was dealing with the Senate Finance Committee, but there was another policy person dealing with the Commerce Committee, et cetera, and I was sort of a little bit of a story, but I was. It was Christmas time, and the person that was supposed to be in charge of the Commerce Committee wasn't going to be there for Christmas, and said, hey, can you watch this bill while it's on the floor that had come out of Commerce Committee? And I said, oh yeah, fine, I can do that. So I'm looking at the bill, and I go, oh my gosh, this was a bill that would make it, that basically interfered in the contracts between the automobile dealers and the manufacturers, the Automobile Manufacturers Association. And so it made things like you couldn't open up a dealership within so many miles of an existing dealership. So GM couldn't open up another dealership within 5 miles or something of an existing dealership. So the Automobile Dealers Association, the Dealers Association, they weren't able to get things written into the contracts with the manufacturers, so they were using the legislature to write the contract. So I look at this thing and I go, whoa, this is a problem. So I go to John Engler, who's the majority leader in the Senate at the time, and I said, John, this, what you're doing here is you're setting this principle that says that the Michigan Senate and the legislature in general can start writing into the contracts things that that parties couldn't agree to start with. And he said, hey, you should have told me that before, because we've already made an agreement with the House, who at the time was the Democrats controlled the House. He said, we've already made an agreement with the House to send this thing over there in return for the House doing something for us. Hey, this baby's going, right? So, of course, it passes, and it passes in the House and becomes law. 2 weeks later, I'm sitting in Senator Posthumus' office, and who are we meeting with? We're meeting with the Boat Dealers Association, right? And the Boat Dealers Association wants to do the same thing we just did for the Automobile Dealers Association. And what are we supposed to tell them? We're supposed to tell them, oh, no, it was okay to do it for the auto dealers, but not okay to do it with you guys. No, what did we do? We passed the law doing it for the Boat Dealers Association. Then what happens? 2 weeks later, we're meeting with the Service Station Dealers Association, right? And so what do? Same thing happens. So we end up with legislation where we've set the general principle that nobody would have started out with. If you started out at the beginning and said, hey, should the legislature go out and be able to write contracts between manufacturers and associations, is that the purpose of what the state legislature is about? You wouldn't have had a majority in the Senate to do that. But we did. And of course, guess who knew that? Karub and Associates was the major lobbying firm, probably still is, but the major lobbying firm. They represented all three of them, right? They represented the Automobile Dealers Association, and of course, they had obviously read Hayek and knew that once they had, done it for one, we were going to have an unintended result that people wouldn't have thought about. I don't know if they really read Hayek, but nonetheless, Karub and Associates knew that once they got it done for this client, it would be much easier to do it for this client and then this client. And again, if you're ever involved in the legislative process, oftentimes a lobbyist will come in and say, oh, well, this is what Nebraska's doing, right? Nebraska passed that, and it made sense to the Nebraska legislature, so hey, we ought to do it, right? And so that if you are not guided by some general principle about how we're going to govern ourselves, you're going to end up with this result that once the majority comes to believe this thing, unless you bind your legislative body by some general principle, then you'll end up with results that perhaps no one intended, or perhaps that nobody wanted in the end. At least a majority wouldn't have wanted it have wanted to have set that general principle. Okay? Then Hayek makes an interesting statement. He says, politicians should not be attempt to be leaders of opinion, but they should act as a weather vane. Right? He says politicians should act as a weather vane, right? And not attempt to affect the formation of opinion. Which seems a little odd, right? He says, but what does he mean by a weather vane? Well, of course, we don't use weather vanes much anymore. But if this were the, 50 years ago, and you drove by a farm, there would be a weather vane that would be up there, and it would show you whichever where the wind was blowing. So that's what weather vanes do, right? They spin and let you know which direction the wind's blowing. Well, why does he say this? He's really saying this is that it's the task of the classical liberal thinker to convince the majority that classical liberalism, or at least what Hayek is talking about in terms of what the role of government is ought to be limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property. Okay, because it's to what? To expand the sphere of free action, to minimize the total amount of coercion. What he's saying here is that the liberal thinker, that is, classical liberal thinker, it's their task to influence the opinions of the rest of the populace. And then once they've convinced them, right, then the politicians will follow. Right? So just as Mises was, why did he write liberalism? Right? He was writing it to say, hey, you guys need to go out there and one of the things he says is liberalism. He says, hey, you have to make people think this is important, right? That's one of the things he says. You got to go out there and convince people this is important to talk about. And then you got to lead them through this so that they become classical liberals. And then what will that do? That will result in us not having the Great Depression and everything else, right? Hayek is saying a similar thing here, that what is the burden of classical liberal thinkers is to persuade people that the role of government is to expand the sphere of free action, to minimize the total amount of coercion, and then once you've convinced people of that, then the politicians will follow, right? If their constituency thinks that we ought to have limited government, then what will happen? They'll become limited government. Now, of course, it's quite possible that you have Ronald Reagan was called the great communicator, okay? So it's possible that your politician should be out there influencing the opinion of the classical liberalism, right? That is, if what their purpose is to persuade the majority that this is the way we ought to do things, then you don't want to say, he's not saying politicians shouldn't go out there and try to influence people's opinion. Everybody should be out there trying to persuade the majority that this is the way we ought to do it. So again, Ronald Reagan might be the person to do that, but he says that essentially what he wants is that the average person, right, to be going out there and being able to talk about this. And again, why do I have essay questions on your exams? So that you can explain to somebody this is why it's important that we have limited government, right? That is, what Hayek is saying, that's the best way to make use of decentralized information or whatever, so that you can go out and persuade other people. And that's all he's really talking about here, is that he basically doesn't want to say, hey, just rely on your politicians to go out and get this right. That's really what he's saying here. It's everyone's responsibility to go out and try to influence other people about why you might want to be a person that believes in limited government. Then he says that the piecemeal changes that happen in democracy only work if the democracy is guided by some set of general principles. He keeps repeating this over and over again throughout the book, but he says that, democracy has these piecemeal changes, right? has these piecemeal changes, what is he saying? He says, okay, we just have statutes that come up, right? That your legislature, the Congress or your state legislature, what are they doing? They're making these changes all, every session, okay? Every session you've got, your state legislature doing something, you've got your county board of supervisors doing something, however you structure it. But nonetheless, there's these piecemeal changes that are happening in a democracy. And what are they looking at? They're looking at particular circumstances. Let's look at, healthcare as an example. Right? So they're going to say, here's some situation in healthcare, let's deal with that, right? Or here's some situation with regard to international relations, or here's some situation that deals with whether we ought to have tariffs on steel or aluminum or whatever. Okay, so we have these individual, circumstances that come up. And democracy responds to that. And he says that if this thing only works if it's guided by a set of principles that define the social order, right? Since it only works if, again, guided by the general principles that define the social order. Again, how are we going to govern ourselves? Right? We need to make that decision about how we're going to govern ourselves before we start writing individual pieces of legislation. That's his point here, right? Because you're going to have individual pieces of legislation all along, right? There's all sorts of stuff happening every day in the United States or every day in the state of Michigan, and your democratic government is making decisions about how to do things along the way, and what has to happen is that's got to be bound by some general principle that we're going to have. And he says that the limiting of democracy is actually there to protect democracy, right? You're not to try to throw out democracy, but the limits on democracy are there to protect democracy, right? Because if you don't limit democracy, what's going to happen? All these things that we've talked about, right? You're going to end up with unintended consequences. You're going to end up with you've set a general principle. You inadvertently set a principle that you hadn't been thinking about, so that whenever you're making legislation or whenever you're doing something within the democratic framework, the idea is, if what you do is you have a set of general principles by which the social order is going to happen, then why are you doing that? To make it so democracy works, right? Because if it's not bound by the set of general principles, what do you end up with? Just tyranny of the majority, right? And all sorts of things that you won't have all the things that Hayek is talking about, what Mises has been talking about. So it's not that classical liberals are opposed to democracy and therefore want to limit what your government can do. It's that they want to have democracy. That's the mechanism by which we're going to govern ourselves. And the only way for that thing to work out correctly is to have it bound by some general principle. Then he talks about the delegation of authority from the legislative branch to the executive branch, right? He warns about delegation of authority. Of the legislative branch to the executive branch. In your Michigan Constitution, in fact, there's a specific provision in your Michigan Constitution that says that one branch of government can't delegate authority to the other branch of government. It's laid out in the Constitution. It is not as direct in the U.S. Constitution, but there's court cases that deal with this. But what is he warning here? He's saying that, you know what, if this happens, right, it's difficult to get it back. That is, if what happens is the legislative body, the legislative branch gives authority away to the executive branch. That is, just delegates things off to let the Department of Environmental Quality do this, or let the Department of Health and Human Services do this. So you're writing a statute, and what you do in the statute, rather than laying out, here's specifically what we want done, why would your constituency, if you sort of think about how this really works, your constituency might say, hey, I want to have clean air, okay? But if what I do is I specify, here's what we're going to do to have clean air, then I'm going to have some people getting irritated, right? But most people will say, oh yeah, I want to have clean air. So if you're a congressperson, what you might do is say, oh, I passed a bill that says we should have clean air. And how are we going to implement that? Well, we're going to have the Department of Environmental Quality do that, right? So what Hayek's point here is that once you've done that, how do you get that power back? And he says it's very difficult to do. Now, I don't know if you've been following this, but there's just a court case that is dealing with what? Executive orders. This is in the state of Michigan, right? There was just a court case. The current governor, Whitmer, was using executive orders to do things under an old statute that gave her emergency powers. And what did they find out? Hard to get that thing back, right? Hard to get that thing back. Senator Shirkey and the majority leader in the Senate, has been talking about this. But anyway, the Mackinac Center was involved in a court case about whether this old law was constitutional or not, et cetera. And it turned out that it was struck down as unconstitutional, and things still up in the air a little bit. But nonetheless, the point is that it was very difficult once you've given that authority. What is Hayek saying here? Once you've given that authority, you've delegated that authority to the executive branch, it's really hard for the legislature to get that authority back or to maintain power of what that authority is. I don't know if you sort of remember, but President Obama, when he's talking about health care bill, he just said, hey, if the Congress doesn't come to that, I've got a pen, right? And I'll just sign an executive order to make it happen, okay? So today, and of course, what's going on now? President Trump has been doing a bunch of executive orders to do what? Overthrow the executive orders of the Obama administration, okay? So what Hayek was talking about in 1960, we sit here and what is that? Half a century later, what are we finding? Exactly what Hayek was talking about. That is, now there's this big debate both at the state of Michigan level and at the federal level about what can be done with executive order, and it's hard for the legislature to get that back. Again, just to summarize, he says that we shouldn't mistake democracy make the mistake of it's a means of securing justice with justice itself. Remember that we said that just because you made a law by democratic vote, right, doesn't mean that that's a just law. Doesn't mean that that is we're going to say that was the most efficient way to do it. Okay, so remember he said it's a means to an end, right? I mean, that's, if you sort of think about, to summarize this chapter, is that what is democracy? It's a means to an end. What do I do when there's only one outcome can prevail. I got to do something, and this is the mechanism by where we're going to do it. Now, it may get it wrong a lot of times, and so how do we make it so that it's more likely to expand the sphere of free action? We limit it by some general principles to limit what that temporary majority can do. All right, chapter 8, again, this is a chapter that you can read on your own. We're not going to talk much about chapter 8, but again, no essay question will be coming from chapter 8. I might come up with a multiple choice question or something like that. So you should read it and be able to recognize the right answer, but you don't have to produce anything with that. That leads us to chapter 9, and of course, this is an important chapter because this is where he talks about what the characteristics of the law should be if they're going to, this is chapter 9, the characteristics of the law that make it so that it's likely to minimize total coercion, right? That's, again, what we're trying to do. We're trying to minimize total coercion. And so he's already talked a little bit about it, but it's interesting that in this chapter, Hayek, he's got this famous quote from Lord Acton you probably heard, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. He disagrees with that. He says that it's the power to coerce that corrupts. You want to have government that can enforce contracts, for example, right? You want to have the government have the power to enforce a contract. Otherwise, maybe we don't agree with those. And we were just talking about this in the law and economics class, right? So you want to have the power to arrest you if you steal my stuff, okay? So it's not the power that corrupts, but the power to coerce you that is corrupting. Again, he has just as Mises talked about monopoly, he has a discussion of monopoly here. And, we discussed monopoly and this idea of, what is profit acts as a signal, and firms can enter the industry. So if you had a firm that's making economic profit, they're the sole producer of something, what you'd expect things to enter that industry. And so he's talking about, again, this just as Mises noted, if there's no barriers to entry, you don't have to worry about it. If there's no barriers to entry, right, monopoly's not a problem. And again, you talked about that on the first midterm, right? If there was a firm making a monopoly profit, we should expect over time prices to fall and output to rise because other firms will enter the industry. And then he says that if there is again, he's worried about the power to coerce. He says, how could a monopoly be bad? A monopoly could be bad if it can coerce. And so what sort of things would you need for that to happen? He says, if you're the sole supplier of a good that is necessary and there are barriers to entry. Okay? And he argues this is very limited. It's very hard to come up with something that you can think of where you absolutely need to have it, and there's only one producer of it, and there's nobody that can come into it. Again, how broadly you define the product can affect how many, you might have a monopoly over kumquats, but you don't have a monopoly over food, okay? So it's possible, the only one you might think about is if there were somehow a situation where there's no substitute for water and I own all the water and nobody else can come in and supply that water, then you'd say, okay, that might be a problem. But what he says that we ought to do about it is that the monopolist had to, if this were to happen, which is very unusual or unlikely, right? It's unlikely, but if it exists, then what do you need to do? You say, okay, the monopolist has to treat everybody equally. Why is that? Because he's worried about coercion, right? And if I have to treat everybody equally, then it's hard for me to coerce you, right? And so that is what Hayek's solution to be. But again, his point, just as Mises talked about and we talked about in monopolies, just because you're the sole producer of something, that doesn't necessarily mean that's a problem, right? And in particular, here he says, look, there's only, if monopoly could somehow coerce you, then that would be a problem. And the solution to that is they're going to make it so that they got to treat everybody the same. Okay? And that would again, it'd have to be something that barriers to entry, and they're the something that you actually have to have. Then he notices that socialism is a complete system of monopoly, right? Socialism that can really coerce you, right? It decides what to be produced, how it's to be produced, how it's to be distributed, and so right? Socialism is a problem because it can coerce you, and so that's something that why you would not want, Mises is talking about socialism can't produce wealth for the masses, right? Hayek's talking about socialism is coercive, right? It's not going to expand the sphere of free action. And then he says is that how do you limit the amount of coercion that's going out there? And he says it's that you can act, you're free to act without others interfering. Right? That's what we want to have. You are free to act without others interfering. They can't interfere with what, it's an F there, there's PH. My wife was a 7th grade teacher and always corrects my spelling. Anyway, you want to be able to act according to your own plan, right? Now, if your actions interfere with me, remember we were talking about Bastiat saying, right, that all the law can do is provide you with the free and inoffensive use of your faculties to make you better off. So we're trying to maximize this ability of people to act according to their own plan. And he says that private property is a key because it creates this sphere of free action. And again, this is exactly what Mises was talking about, right? But that private property creates the sphere of free action. Right? And so I want to have private property rights. That's why private property is one of the foundations of liberalism, right? The foundation, one of the foundations of liberalism is about private property. And why would Hayek agree with that? Because he says that's what creates the sphere of free action. The government needs a warrant, to come into your house or to look in your car or anything like that. All right. So what we're going to do for Wednesday is we will finish chapter 9, and chapter 10 is will be a summary chapter. Okay. Chapter 11 is going to be like chapter 8, where you're just going to read it. We'll spend a good deal of time then on chapter 12, right? So we're going to finish chapter 9 where we go over what the characteristics of good law are, and you're going to see that on the midterm. What are the characteristics of good law? But as we move forward, 10 and 11 we're not going to spend as much time on that. All right?